In the summer of 1945, the world stood at a precipice. Two Japanese cities lay in ruins, consumed by atomic fire. Hiroshima had been devastated on August 6th, and Nagasaki followed on August 9th. The world knew about these two bombs. What most people don't know is that there was a third atomic bomb, assembled and ready to go. And the story of where it was meant to be dropped, who stopped it, and what it reveals about the final days of World War II is far more complex and disturbing than most history books acknowledge. This is the story of the third bomb, the bomb that wasn't dropped, the bomb that Harry Truman wanted to use, and the frantic scramble to end the war before it could be deployed. Let's start with what we think we know about the atomic bombings of Japan. The conventional narrative goes something like this. The United States developed the atomic bomb through the Manhattan Project. Japan refused to surrender despite facing certain defeat. President Truman made the difficult decision to use the bomb to end the war quickly and save American lives that would have been lost in an invasion. Two bombs were dropped. Japan surrendered. The war ended. Case closed. But this narrative, while containing elements of truth, obscures a far more complicated reality. The atomic bombings weren't a simple binary choice between invasion and capitulation. They were part of a rapidly evolving military and political situation where momentum, bureaucracy, revenge, and the desire to demonstrate American power all played crucial roles. To understand the third bomb, we need to understand the production schedule of atomic weapons in 1945. This wasn't like conventional munitions, where factories could churn out thousands of units. Each atomic bomb represented an enormous investment of resources, time, and rare materials. The Manhattan Project had developed two different types of atomic weapons. The first was a gun-type uranium bomb, nicknamed Little Boy. This design was relatively simple in concept. Fire one piece of uranium-235 into another piece to achieve critical mass and trigger a chain reaction. The scientists were so confident this design would work that they didn't even test it before using it on Hiroshima. The second design was far more complex. This was an implosion-type plutonium bomb, nicknamed Fat Man. It required conventional explosives arranged in a precise spherical pattern around a plutonium core. When detonated, these explosives would compress the plutonium to supercritical density, initiating a nuclear explosion. This design was so uncertain that it required a full-scale test, which took place at Trinity Site in New Mexico on July 16, 1945. By early August 1945, the United States had exactly two bombs ready for combat use. Little Boy was loaded onto the B-29 Enola Gay and dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th. Fat Man was dropped on Nagasaki 3 days later on August 9th. But the Manhattan Project wasn't stopping production. Far from it. The enormous industrial complex that had been built to produce fissile material was still operating at full capacity. Los Alamos was still assembling weapons. The military bureaucracy, once set in motion, was incredibly difficult to stop. According to declassified documents and statements from key Manhattan Project personnel, another plutonium bomb core was ready by August 12th or 13th, just days after Nagasaki. Some sources suggest it might have been ready even earlier, possibly by August 10th. General Leslie Groves, the military director of the Manhattan Project, later stated that additional bombs could have been ready for delivery at a rate of roughly one every 10 days after the Nagasaki bombing. This third bomb was real, it was being assembled, and there were plans for its use. So where was this third bomb supposed to be dropped? This is where the story becomes murkier and more contentious among historians. Unlike Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there was no single definitive target selected for the third bomb, in part because the question of whether it would be used at all became wrapped up in the rapidly evolving situation surrounding Japan's surrender. However, several cities were under serious consideration. The target committee that had selected Hiroshima and Nagasaki had originally identified several potential targets. These included Kokura, which was actually the primary target for the second bomb, before cloud cover forced the bombardier to switch to Nagasaki. Niigata had also been on the list, as had Yokohama and Kyoto, though Kyoto was removed from the list due to its cultural and historical significance, largely thanks to the intervention of Secretary of War Henry Stimson. After Nagasaki, with Japan still not having formally surrendered, military planners were looking at additional targets. Tokyo itself was under consideration, though much of it had already been devastated by conventional firebombing. Other cities that appeared in various military documents included Sapporo in the north and various smaller cities that still retained military or industrial significance. But here's what makes this story particularly significant. The decision about the third bomb wasn't really about selecting the right target. It was about whether the atomic bombing campaign would continue at all, and who had the authority to make that decision. On August 10th, the day after Nagasaki was bombed, Japan sent a message through neutral Switzerland indicating a willingness to surrender, provided that the emperor could remain in his position. This was the beginning of what would become several days of tense diplomatic negotiations. Japan hadn't fully surrendered, but they had made the first move toward ending the war. The same day, President Truman held a cabinet meeting. According to multiple accounts, including those from Commerce Secretary Henry Wallace's diary, Truman made a striking statement. He said he had given orders to stop atomic bombing. The reason he gave was that he didn't like the idea of killing all those kids. This is a remarkable and revealing moment. It suggests that Truman had not fully grasped the human consequences of the atomic weapons until after they had been used. It also indicates that there was, in fact, a continuing bombing campaign planned, and that Truman had to actively intervene to stop it. But Truman's order created a crucial question. Who actually controlled the atomic bombs? Was every use of an atomic weapon a presidential decision? Or had they simply become another weapon in the military's arsenal to be used at the discretion of field commanders? This might seem like a strange question to ask in retrospect, but in August 1945, there was genuine ambiguity. The atomic bomb program had been run by the military under General Groves. The bombs were delivered by the Army Air Forces. The targeting decisions had been made by a committee that included military officers. Truman had approved the use of atomic weapons against Japan, but had he approved each specific use, or had he approved a campaign? The original orders, issued on July 25th, instructed the 509th Composite Group to deliver atomic bombs as soon as weather will permit visual bombing after about 3rd August 1945. Note the lack of specificity. It wasn't drop one bomb and await further orders. It was an ongoing authorization. The order continued. Additional bombs will be delivered on the above targets as soon as made ready by the project staff. Additional bombs, plural, as soon as made ready. This was a campaign, not a single strike or even 2 strikes. General Groves certainly interpreted his orders this way. He later wrote that he understood his authorization to continue until told to stop. The third bomb was being readied because, from his perspective, that was what he had been ordered to do. This created a genuine crisis of command and control. The most powerful weapons ever created were, arguably, operating under standing orders that no longer reflected the president's wishes or the rapidly changing political situation. Truman had told his cabinet he ordered the bombing stopped, but was his order transmitted clearly through the chain of command? Had the military infrastructure that was preparing the third bomb received the message? Secretary of War Henry Stimson and General George Marshall became deeply concerned about this situation. On August 10th, Marshall issued orders that no further atomic bombs were to be dropped without express presidential authorization. This was a crucial intervention that established clear civilian control over atomic weapons. But here's the disturbing part. Marshall's order came after Japan had already indicated a willingness to surrender. What if Japan hadn't sent that message on August 10th? What if the negotiations had dragged on for days or weeks? The third bomb would have been ready. There was a target list, and under the original orders, it would have been dropped. Some historians argue that Truman and his advisors were fully prepared to drop a third bomb if Japan didn't surrender quickly. They point to statements from Truman and others indicating that the atomic bombing campaign would continue until Japan capitulated. The atomic bomb, in this view, wasn't seen as fundamentally different from the conventional bombing campaign that had already killed hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians. It was just more efficient. Others argue that the third bomb represented a threshold that Truman was reluctant to cross. The shock value of the atomic bomb lay partly in its novelty. Dropping one demonstrated American technological superiority. Dropping two showed it wasn't a fluke. But dropping 3, 4, 5... that started to look less like a war-ending shock weapon and more like a campaign of systematic annihilation. It raised uncomfortable questions about whether the goal was forcing surrender or simply destroying Japan entirely. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Truman was not a man given to deep moral introspection about military necessity. He had approved the conventional firebombing of Japanese cities that killed more people than the atomic bombs did. He was prepared to invade Japan if necessary, which would have resulted in massive casualties on both sides. But the atomic bomb was different in some ineffable way that even Truman seemed to recognize. His comment about all those kids suggests a man confronting the reality of what he had unleashed. The period between August 10th and August 15th was extraordinarily tense. Japan's initial surrender offer was conditional. They wanted to keep the emperor. The American response was deliberately ambiguous, saying the emperor's authority would be subject to the supreme commander of the Allied powers. This wasn't quite an acceptance of Japan's terms, but it wasn't an outright rejection either. During this diplomatic dance, the military situation remained active. Conventional bombing of Japan continued. The Soviet Union, which had declared war on Japan on August 9th, was rapidly advancing through Manchuria and Korea. American submarines were still sinking Japanese ships. And at Los Alamos, technicians were still working on the third bomb. There were voices in the American military establishment arguing for continued atomic attacks. Some Army Air Force leaders believed that a systematic campaign of atomic bombing could completely break Japan's will to resist without an invasion. They saw the atomic bomb as the logical culmination of the strategic bombing doctrine that had been developed during the war. The idea that you could defeat an enemy by destroying their industrial capacity and breaking civilian morale. This doctrine was controversial even then. Many military officers, particularly in the Navy, were skeptical of strategic bombing's effectiveness. They pointed out that Germany had been bombed far more heavily than Japan and had still fought to the bitter end. Some believed that Japan was already so close to surrender that no additional bombing, atomic or conventional, was necessary. There was also the geopolitical dimension. By mid-August, it was clear that the Soviet Union was emerging as America's primary rival in the post-war world. Some American policymakers saw the atomic bomb not just as a weapon against Japan, but as a demonstration of American power for Soviet consumption. The more bombs dropped, the more impressive the demonstration. This logic suggested continuing the atomic campaign. But others worried about exactly the opposite problem. If America continued to drop atomic bombs on already defeated Japan, how would that be perceived internationally? Would it strengthen America's post-war position, or would it make America look like a ruthless monster? These questions were particularly acute because the United States was positioning itself as a defender of civilization and human rights against totalitarianism. Hard to maintain that image while systematically annihilating Japanese cities. General Groves, meanwhile, was thinking about the bombs themselves. Each plutonium core represented an enormous investment. The production process was complex and slow. Groves knew that the American atomic arsenal in August 1945 consisted of exactly what was being produced at that moment. There were no stockpiles. Every bomb used was one less bomb in the arsenal. This might seem counterintuitive. Why wouldn't you use the weapons you had to end the war quickly? But Groves was already thinking about the post-war world. The Manhattan Project hadn't just built a couple of bombs. It had built the infrastructure for atomic weapon production. Groves saw this infrastructure as a permanent fixture of American military power. He was thinking about deterrence, about maintaining American atomic supremacy, about the bomb as a geopolitical tool rather than just a tactical weapon. From this perspective, dropping the third bomb made less sense. If Japan was on the verge of surrender anyway, why expend a scarce resource? Better to keep it in reserve. The very existence of additional bombs, the knowledge that America could produce more, might be more valuable than the actual destruction they could cause. These calculations were all happening simultaneously in mid-August 1945, creating a chaotic decision-making environment. Truman was trying to manage surrender negotiations while also controlling his own military. The Joint Chiefs were trying to prepare for all contingencies, including both an invasion and continued bombing. The Manhattan Project leadership was trying to maintain production while also responding to shifting political priorities. And in the middle of all this, there was a third atomic bomb, nearly ready, waiting for a decision about its fate. On August 12th, Japan's response to the American surrender terms was still unclear. Hardliners in the Japanese military were arguing for continuing the war. There was even an attempted coup by junior officers who wanted to prevent surrender. The situation was fluid and dangerous. If the negotiations broke down, what would happen? According to some accounts, Groves was asked to estimate how quickly a sustained atomic bombing campaign could be conducted. His answer was grim. One bomb every 7 to 10 days through the rest of August and into September, then increasing production would allow for more frequent attacks. By this schedule, a dozen or more Japanese cities could have been destroyed by the end of 1945. This projection is shocking, but it was based on real production capabilities. The reactors at Hanford were producing plutonium continuously. The uranium enrichment facilities at Oak Ridge were operating around the clock. Los Alamos had refined its bomb assembly procedures. The infrastructure was in place for sustained atomic warfare. But this assumed that the political will for such a campaign existed, and increasingly it didn't. Even among military leaders who were generally supportive of strategic bombing, there was growing discomfort with the idea of systematically destroying Japanese cities with atomic weapons. It felt different from conventional bombing, even if the death tolls were comparable or even smaller. Part of this was the simple shock of the weapons themselves. The footage from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, even the limited imagery available in August 1945, was haunting. The complete devastation of vast areas, the strange radiation effects that were killing people days and weeks after the bombing, the reports of people vaporized by the blast, leaving only shadows burned into walls. It was one thing to know intellectually that hundreds of thousands of people had died in the Tokyo firebombing. It was another to see the alien landscape created by atomic weapons. There was also a practical consideration that often gets overlooked: target availability. Japan had already been heavily bombed by conventional means. Most major cities had been hit repeatedly. The list of targets suitable for atomic attack, militarily significant, urban, relatively undamaged, was actually quite short. Hiroshima had been deliberately left off the conventional bombing target list so it could be used to demonstrate the atomic bomb's effectiveness. You couldn't do that indefinitely. If the atomic bombing campaign had continued, the military would have faced an awkward choice: either bomb targets that had already been heavily damaged, which would dilute the demonstration of atomic power, or start bombing smaller cities and towns, which would look increasingly like terrorism rather than strategic warfare. Neither option was appealing from a propaganda perspective. On August 14th, Japan agreed to surrender unconditionally, accepting the terms laid out in the Potsdam Declaration. The formal surrender ceremony would take place on September 2nd aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The war was over. The third bomb would not be needed. But what happened to that third bomb? The plutonium core that had been prepared was eventually used in atomic testing at Bikini Atoll. The infrastructure that had produced it continued operating, producing more cores, building more bombs. The atomic age had begun, and there would be no going back. The story of the third bomb raises profound questions about nuclear weapons and their control. In the heat of war, atomic bombs had been treated almost like conventional weapons, built on a production schedule, deployed according to military plans, used as tools of strategic bombing. It took a deliberate intervention by civilian leadership to assert control over these weapons and establish that their use required explicit presidential authorization. This established an important precedent. From August 1945 onward, the use of nuclear weapons has been understood as a presidential decision, not a military one. The mechanisms of civilian control over nuclear weapons, the nuclear football, the two-man rule, the elaborate command and control systems, all stem from this moment of crisis when there was genuine ambiguity about who controlled the most powerful weapons ever created. But the crisis also revealed something troubling: how easy it would have been to continue the atomic bombing campaign. There was no technical obstacle. The bombs could be produced. The delivery systems existed. The target lists were prepared. What stopped the third bomb from being dropped wasn't technology or capability, but political decision-making. And that decision was a near thing. Some historians have speculated about what would have happened if Japan had delayed its surrender by even a week or two. Would Truman have maintained his order to stop atomic bombing? Or would military and political pressure have pushed him to resume the campaign? We can never know for certain, but the fact that the question is even plausible tells us something important about how close the world came to a very different outcome. The third bomb also complicates our understanding of the decision to use atomic weapons in the first place. The conventional narrative treats the atomic bombings as a discrete event, a difficult decision made after careful deliberation to use a novel weapon to end the war quickly. But the reality was messier. The decision to use atomic weapons was not a single choice, but a series of choices embedded in military plans, production schedules, and bureaucratic momentum. Once the infrastructure was in place and the orders were given, stopping the atomic bombing required active intervention, not passive decision-making. This has implications for how we think about nuclear weapons today. The mechanisms of nuclear deterrence, arms control, and non-proliferation all assume that the use of nuclear weapons is a deliberate, high-level political decision. But the history of the third bomb suggests that bureaucratic and military factors can create their own momentum, pushing toward weapon use unless actively restrained by political leadership. The men who built and deployed the first atomic bombs were not monsters. They were patriots, scientists, and military officers who believed they were working to end a terrible war. But they had created something that transcended their original intentions. The atomic bomb was not just a bigger explosive. It was a weapon that could, if unconstrained, systematically destroy civilization. Recognizing that reality and establishing appropriate controls was a crucial moment in human history. Let's talk about the human dimension of this story. While we're discussing bombs and strategic decisions, it's important to remember that we're talking about weapons that would have been used against cities full of people. The third bomb, if dropped, would have killed tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands more Japanese civilians. By mid-August 1945, Japan was already in desperate straits. The conventional bombing campaign had destroyed much of the country's industrial capacity. The naval blockade had cut off essential supplies. Food was scarce. Millions of people had been displaced from their homes. The military situation was hopeless, even if some Japanese leaders refused to acknowledge it. The people who would have died if the third bomb had been dropped were not soldiers on a battlefield. They were children, elderly people, workers, families. They were people who had already endured years of war and hardship. The Japanese government's decision to continue fighting was prolonging their suffering, but that doesn't change the moral weight of the decision to drop atomic bombs on population centers. This moral dimension was not lost on everyone involved in the Manhattan Project. Some scientists who had worked on the bomb were deeply troubled by its use against cities. The Frank Report, submitted to the War Department in June 1945, argued that the bomb should first be demonstrated in an unpopulated area before being used against Japan. This proposal was rejected by the interim committee advising Truman on atomic policy, but it shows that there were dissenters even among those who had built the weapon. After the war, many Manhattan Project scientists became advocates for international control of atomic energy and for arms control more generally. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientific director of Los Alamos, famously quoted the Bhagavad Gita after the Trinity test: "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." His later advocacy for restraint in nuclear weapons development would lead to him being stripped of his security clearance during the McCarthy era. But in August 1945, these moral qualms were not the dominant factor in decision-making. The prevailing view among American leadership was that the atomic bomb was a legitimate weapon of war, that its use was justified by military necessity, and that the deaths of enemy civilians, while regrettable, were an acceptable cost of ending the war quickly and saving American lives. This utilitarian calculus is still controversial today. Some historians argue that Japan was already on the verge of surrender, that the atomic bombs were unnecessary, and that the real motivation was to end the war before the Soviet Union could claim a significant role in Japan's defeat. Others maintain that the bombs saved lives by preventing a bloody invasion, and that they shocked Japan's leadership into accepting the reality of defeat. The truth is probably that different decision-makers had different motivations. Truman genuinely seemed to believe the bombs would shorten the war and save American lives. Some military leaders saw the bombs as a culmination of strategic bombing doctrine. Some policymakers were thinking about post-war geopolitics and the Soviet Union. And some were probably motivated by a desire for revenge after Pearl Harbor and years of brutal warfare in the Pacific. The third bomb fits into this complex picture as evidence that the atomic bombing campaign was not conceived as a one-time shock, but as an ongoing military operation. The fact that additional bombs were being prepared and that there were plans for their use tells us something important about how American leadership was thinking about these weapons in August 1945. Let's consider the Japanese perspective more carefully. We often talk about the atomic bombs as if they were the decisive factor in Japan's surrender, but the situation was more complicated. Japan's government in August 1945 was deeply divided between those who wanted to surrender and those who wanted to fight on, even in the face of certain defeat. The faction that wanted to continue fighting centered around War Minister Korichika Anami, and parts of the army leadership was not entirely irrational in their thinking. They believed that if Japan could inflict enough casualties on an invading American force, the United States might be willing to negotiate a peace that would preserve some aspects of the Japanese Empire and the existing political order. They saw the war not as something to win, but as a way to secure better surrender terms. The atomic bombs certainly influenced the internal Japanese debate, but so did other factors. The Soviet declaration of war on August 9th was arguably just as significant. Japan had been hoping that the Soviet Union might mediate a negotiated peace. When the Soviets instead invaded Manchuria, that hope evaporated. Suddenly, Japan faced the prospect of being occupied by the Soviet Union, which was even more terrifying to the Japanese leadership than American occupation. Emperor Hirohito's intervention was ultimately decisive. On August 9th, after the Nagasaki bombing and the Soviet invasion, the emperor broke a tie in the Supreme War Council and supported surrender. He intervened again on August 14th to overrule military hardliners who wanted to reject the Allied surrender terms. These imperial interventions were unprecedented and showed how desperate the situation had become. Would the emperor have intervened without the atomic bombs? We can never know for certain, but it's worth noting that the conventional bombing and naval blockade had already brought Japan to the brink of collapse. The atomic bombs accelerated the decision, but they were not the only factor. This raises a counterfactual question. If the third bomb had been dropped, would it have made any difference? By August 12th or 13th, the emperor had already decided to surrender. The hardliners were attempting their coup, but they were doomed to fail. Dropping a third atomic bomb wouldn't have changed the fundamental political dynamics within Japan. It would have just killed more people. This is part of why Truman's order to stop atomic bombing was so important. Once Japan had indicated a willingness to surrender, continuing to drop atomic bombs would have served no military purpose. It would have been slaughter for its own sake, or at best a demonstration of power for international consumption. That Truman recognized this and stopped the bombing reflects better on him than the decision to start it in the first place. But let's not romanticize this too much. Truman's order came only after Japan had moved towards surrender. If Japan had remained intransigent, there's every reason to believe the atomic bombing would have continued. The third bomb was ready. More bombs were being prepared. The infrastructure and the will to use them existed. The only thing that stopped the third bomb was Japan's decision to surrender when they did. Now let's talk about something that often gets overlooked in discussions of the atomic bombings: the mechanics of actually producing and delivering these weapons. The Manhattan Project was an enormous undertaking, involving hundreds of thousands of people at sites across the United States. To understand how a third bomb could have been ready so quickly after Nagasaki, we need to understand this production system. Plutonium, the fissile material for the implosion bomb, was produced at the Hanford site in Washington state. The process involved irradiating uranium in nuclear reactors, which would transmute some of the uranium into plutonium. This plutonium would then be chemically separated from the remaining uranium and other byproducts in a complex and dangerous process. The result was weapons-grade plutonium that could be used in a bomb core. By August 1945, Hanford had 3 reactors operating continuously. These reactors were producing plutonium faster than Los Alamos could assemble it into bombs. This meant that by the time the Nagasaki bomb was dropped, there was already enough plutonium for the third core, and more was being produced every day. The bomb assembly process at Los Alamos had also been refined and streamlined. The Fat Man bomb was incredibly complex, with thousands of precisely manufactured components. But by August, the team at Los Alamos had built several of these bombs and had the process down to a science. They could assemble a complete bomb in a matter of days once the plutonium core was available. The delivery system was also in place. The 509th Composite Group, specially trained to deliver atomic bombs, was stationed on Tinian Island in the Mariana Islands. They had B-29 bombers modified for atomic missions and crews trained in the specific protocols for atomic bombing runs. They had successfully carried out 2 atomic missions and were ready to fly another as soon as a bomb was available. Logistics were also surprisingly efficient. Bombs could be transported from Los Alamos to Tinian in a matter of days. The cores would be shipped separately from the rest of the bomb components for safety reasons, then assembled on Tinian. The whole system, from plutonium production to final assembly to delivery, was designed to be continuous and rapid. This industrial and logistical capability is what made the third bomb possible, and what would have made 4th, 5th, and subsequent bombs possible if the war had continued. The Manhattan Project wasn't just a scientific experiment. It was a full-scale industrial program designed to produce atomic weapons on an ongoing basis. General Groves, the military director of the Manhattan Project, was proud of this capability. He saw it as a triumph of American industrial and organizational prowess. The United States had not only developed the most powerful weapon in history, but had also created a system to produce it in quantity. This gave the United States an enormous strategic advantage in the emerging post-war world. But this capability also created problems. Industrial systems, once established, developed their own momentum and constituencies. The scientists, engineers, and workers at Hanford and Los Alamos didn't stop working just because 2 bombs had been dropped. They had jobs to do and missions to accomplish. The infrastructure didn't shut down. The reactors kept running. More plutonium cores were produced. This is part of what made the question of the third bomb so urgent. It wasn't a hypothetical question about whether the United States could produce another bomb. The bomb was being produced whether anyone explicitly ordered it or not. The question was whether to stop a process already in motion, not whether to start a new one. This pattern would repeat throughout the Cold War. Once the infrastructure for nuclear weapons production was in place, it proved extremely difficult to shut down or even slow down. Arms control agreements and strategic reassessments would have to contend with the enormous bureaucratic and industrial momentum of nuclear weapons programs. The story of the third bomb, in microcosm, foreshadowed this dynamic. There's also the human element of the production system. Thousands of people were working on the Manhattan Project in August 1945. For many of them, it was just a job, albeit an important one. They didn't necessarily know all the details of what they were building or how it was being used. They knew they were working on something important for the war effort, and they took pride in their work. When you're a technician at Hanford operating a reactor, or a machinist at Los Alamos fabricating bomb components, you don't think of yourself as preparing to kill hundreds of thousands of people. You think of yourself as doing your part to win the war and bring the boys home. The moral weight of nuclear weapons gets distributed across so many people and so many steps that no individual feels fully responsible. This diffusion of responsibility is a feature of modern warfare generally, but it's particularly acute with nuclear weapons. The people who mined the uranium, enriched it, manufactured the components, assembled the bombs, loaded them on planes, and dropped them, could all tell themselves they were just following orders and doing their jobs. The moral responsibility for the decision to use the bombs could be placed on political leadership, but those leaders could argue they were simply using the tools their military and scientific establishment had provided. The third bomb represents a crystallization of this diffusion of responsibility. No one explicitly ordered, produce a third bomb to drop on Japan. It happened because the system was designed to keep producing bombs, and no one stopped it until Truman and Marshall intervened. This raises troubling questions about agency and responsibility in systems of industrialized warfare. Let's talk about some of the specific individuals involved in this story, because history is ultimately made by human decisions, not abstract forces. Harry Truman is obviously central to the narrative. He became president only in April 1945, after Franklin Roosevelt's death. He had not been intimately involved in the development of the atomic bomb and had to come up to speed quickly on one of the most momentous decisions in history. Truman's decision-making process regarding the atomic bomb has been endlessly debated by historians. Some portray him as decisive and clear-eyed, willing to make hard choices for the greater good. Others see him as ill-informed and too deferential to military advice, making a decision without fully understanding the implications. Still others argue he didn't really make a decision at all. The momentum of the Manhattan Project and military planning meant the bombs would be used unless he explicitly stopped them, which he didn't do until after Nagasaki. Truman's comment about all those kids on August 10th is revealing. It suggests he hadn't fully confronted the human reality of atomic bombing until after it happened. This is not entirely surprising. Truman was a product of his time and his military experience. He had served in World War I. He understood warfare as a terrible but sometimes necessary business. The idea of civilian casualties in strategic bombing was not new or shocking to him in principle. But the atomic bomb was different in degree, if not in kind. The sheer scale of destruction, concentrated in a single instant, forced a reckoning with what modern warfare meant. Truman's reaction suggests a man who had thought he understood what he was ordering, but then confronted the reality and was disturbed by it. Secretary of War Henry Stimson played a crucial role in these events. Stimson was 77 years old in August 1945, a veteran statesman who had served in government for decades. He had been intimately involved in the Manhattan Project from its inception and had overseen the decision-making process about target selection and use. Stimson was the one who insisted that Kyoto be removed from the target list because of its cultural and historical significance. He understood that the atomic bomb was not just a military weapon, but a tool with enormous political and moral implications. He worried about how its use would affect America's post-war standing and reputation. In mid-August, Stimson was instrumental in establishing clear civilian control over atomic weapons. He worked with General Marshall to ensure that Truman's order to stop atomic bombing was clearly communicated and enforced. He understood that the question of control over these weapons was just as important as the decision to use them in the first place. General Leslie Groves, the military director of the Manhattan Project, is a fascinating and complex figure. Groves was a career Army engineer who had overseen the construction of the Pentagon before being assigned to the Manhattan Project. He was brilliant, demanding, and absolutely determined to make the project succeed. Groves saw the atomic bomb in primarily military terms. It was the ultimate weapon, the culmination of American technological and industrial superiority. He was proud of what his project had accomplished and wanted to demonstrate its capabilities. For Groves, the question of continuing atomic bombing was largely a matter of military effectiveness. If more bombs would help win the war, they should be used. But Groves also understood the geopolitical implications. He knew that the atomic bomb would be a dominant factor in post-war international relations. He wanted to ensure the United States maintained its atomic monopoly as long as possible. This created a tension in his thinking about using bombs. Each bomb used was one less bomb in the arsenal, but using bombs demonstrated American capability and will. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientific director of Los Alamos, was becoming increasingly troubled by what his creation had wrought. Oppenheimer had driven the scientific effort to build the bomb with enormous energy and intelligence. He was a brilliant theoretical physicist who proved to be an exceptional manager and leader. But after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Oppenheimer began to grapple with the moral implications of nuclear weapons. His famous comment about becoming death, the destroyer of worlds, captured a growing sense of unease. Many scientists who had worked on the bomb felt a similar ambivalence. They had believed they were racing to build the bomb before Nazi Germany could, but Germany had surrendered before the bomb was ready. The use of the bomb against Japan raised different questions. Oppenheimer did not publicly oppose the use of the atomic bomb in August 1945, but he would later become an advocate for international control of atomic energy and for restraint in nuclear weapons development. His transformation from weapon builder to arms control advocate reflects the psychological journey many Manhattan Project scientists made as they confronted what they had created. Admiral William Leahy, Truman's chief of staff, was skeptical of the atomic bomb from the start. Leahy was a career naval officer who believed in traditional military values. He thought the atomic bomb was an immoral weapon that violated the rules of warfare. He also doubted its military necessity, believing that the naval blockade and conventional bombing would force Japan to surrender eventually. Leahy's views didn't prevail in the decision to use the bomb, but they represented an important perspective within the military leadership. Not everyone was enthusiastic about atomic weapons. Some saw them as a dangerous and uncontrollable innovation that threatened traditional military values and international norms. On the Japanese side, Emperor Hirohito ultimately made the decision to surrender, but he was influenced by a small group of advisors who understood the desperate situation Japan faced. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo was a key advocate for surrender. He understood that continuing the war was futile and would only bring more destruction. War Minister Korechika Anami represented the opposing view. He wanted to retry G, continued to continue fighting, hoping to inflict enough casualties on an invading American force to secure better surrender terms. Anami was not simply a fanatic. He was following a strategic logic that made sense within a certain framework. If Japan could make the cost of invasion high enough, perhaps the Americans would negotiate rather than pay that price. The atomic bombs and the Soviet invasion shattered this logic. There would be no invasion to resist. The Americans could simply keep dropping atomic bombs until Japan was destroyed. The Soviets were advancing rapidly and might occupy significant Japanese territory before any negotiated surrender could be arranged. The situation that the hardliners had been planning for had evaporated. Anami ultimately supported the emperor's decision to surrender, despite his earlier opposition. He committed suicide on the night of August 14th, 15th, following the samurai tradition. His suicide note expressed loyalty to the emperor and apologized for failing to achieve victory. It was a tragic end to a man who had been trying to serve his country as he understood it, even when that service meant prolonging a hopeless war. The coup attempt by junior officers on August 14th to 15th was a last desperate effort by those who refused to accept surrender. The plotters tried to seize the imperial palace and prevent the broadcast of the emperor's surrender announcement. They failed, partly because senior military officers refused to support them, and partly because they simply didn't have enough forces under their control. The failure of this coup is significant for our story. If the coup had succeeded, if the hardliners had managed to prevent surrender, the third bomb would almost certainly have been dropped. The momentum toward continued atomic bombing would have been overwhelming. Truman's order to stop could have been countermanded if Japan appeared to be rejecting surrender and fighting on. This is one of the great counterfactual questions of World War II. What if the coup had succeeded? How many more atomic bombs would have been dropped? Would Japan have eventually surrendered anyway, or would the war have dragged on into the fall of 1945? Would the Soviet Union have invaded the Japanese home islands? The fact that we're asking these questions shows how contingent the end of the war really was. Let's talk about the immediate aftermath of Japan's surrender and what happened to the atomic bomb program. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito's radio broadcast announced Japan's surrender to the Japanese people. This was the first time most Japanese had heard the emperor's voice. The broadcast was in formal classical Japanese that many listeners had difficulty understanding, but the message was clear enough. The war was over. Japan had been defeated. For the Manhattan Project, this raised immediate questions. What would happen to the program now that the war was over? The infrastructure was still in place. The reactors were still producing plutonium. The enrichment facilities were still operating. Bombs were still being assembled. Did all of this just stop? The answer was no. The Manhattan Project continued operations after Japan's surrender, though at a gradually reduced pace. General Groves argued that the United States needed to maintain its atomic capabilities in the post-war world. The Soviet Union was emerging as a potential adversary, and the atomic bomb was America's ace in the hole. The third bomb core that had been prepared in August was eventually used in the first post-war atomic test at Bikini Atoll in July 1946. This test, called Operation Crossroads, was designed to study the effects of atomic weapons on naval vessels. It was also a demonstration of American atomic power for international consumption, particularly aimed at impressing the Soviet Union. More bombs were produced in the months and years after the war. By the end of 1945, the United States had perhaps half a dozen atomic bombs. By 1950, the arsenal had grown to several hundred. The production infrastructure that had been built to supply a potential atomic bombing campaign against Japan was repurposed to build a nuclear arsenal for the Cold War. This continuity is important. The atomic bomb didn't end with the surrender of Japan. It became a permanent feature of international relations and military strategy. The systems and institutions created by the Manhattan Project evolved into the nuclear weapons complex that still exists today. The third bomb that wasn't dropped became the first of thousands of bombs that were built during the Cold War arms race. The establishment of civilian control over atomic weapons in August 1945 also had lasting implications. The Atomic Energy Act of 1946 created the Atomic Energy Commission as a civilian agency to oversee atomic energy development. This was a deliberate decision to keep atomic weapons under civilian control rather than purely military management. However, the military obviously retained a crucial role in nuclear weapons policy. The Strategic Air Command, created in 1946, became the primary operator of nuclear weapons. The development of nuclear strategy, targeting policy, and weapons design all involved close collaboration between civilian and military authorities. The tension between civilian control and military operational needs has been a constant theme in nuclear weapons policy ever since. Who has the authority to use nuclear weapons? Under what circumstances? With how much warning and deliberation? These questions, first raised in acute form by the third bomb crisis in August 1945, have never been fully resolved. Let's consider the broader historical context of strategic bombing in World War II, because the atomic bombings didn't happen in isolation. They were the culmination of a strategic bombing campaign that had been targeting Japanese cities for months. The firebombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, killed an estimated 100,000 people, more than either atomic bomb would kill. The bomber crews dropped napalm incendiaries that created a firestorm, burning vast swaths of the city. People died from burns, from asphyxiation, from drowning in canals where they had jumped to escape the flames. It was one of the deadliest single bombing raids in history. This wasn't an isolated incident. Over the following months, the Army Air Forces conducted similar raids against dozens of Japanese cities. By August 1945, Japan's major urban centers had been devastated. Millions of people had been killed or displaced. The country's industrial capacity had been shattered. The atomic bombs have to be understood in this context. They were not a radical departure from existing bombing policy. They were an intensification of it. The strategic bombing doctrine that had been applied with conventional weapons was simply being applied with a more efficient tool. One plane, one bomb, one destroyed city. It was more economical than sending hundreds of bombers with thousands of incendiaries. But the end result, a destroyed city and tens of thousands of dead civilians, was similar. This is why many American military and political leaders didn't see the atomic bomb as raising fundamentally new moral questions. They had already accepted the strategic bombing of cities as a legitimate act of war. The atomic bomb just did it more efficiently. From this perspective, Truman's order to stop atomic bombing after Nagasaki was puzzling. Why was killing 70,000 people with one atomic bomb worse than killing 100,000 people with thousands of conventional bombs? The answer, I think, is that the atomic bomb forced a reckoning with the logic of strategic bombing in a way that conventional bombing somehow didn't. The concentration of destruction in a single instant, the alien nature of atomic weapons, the radiation effects, all of this made it impossible to look away from what was being done. The atomic bomb made visible what had been obscured in conventional strategic bombing, the systematic slaughter of civilian populations as an instrument of military strategy. Some critics of the atomic bombings argue that the real moral crime was not the use of atomic weapons specifically, but the entire strategic bombing campaign against Japanese and German cities. From this perspective, the atomic bombings were simply the most visible examples of a policy that was morally questionable throughout. The focus on atomic weapons, while understandable, obscures the larger questions about area bombing and civilian targeting. Others argue that the atomic bomb was qualitatively different. The radiation effects, which killed people weeks and months after the bombing, represented a new kind of indiscriminate weapon. The potential for atomic weapons to escalate into civilization-ending nuclear war meant they had to be treated differently from conventional weapons, no matter how destructive conventional weapons might be. These debates have continued for decades and show no signs of being resolved. What's clear is that the atomic bombings didn't happen in a vacuum. They were part of a broader strategic and moral framework about how to wage war against an enemy's civilian population and industrial base. The question of whether the atomic bombs were necessary to end the war is similarly complex and contested. The traditional view, as articulated by Truman and his defenders, is straightforward. Japan was determined to fight to the bitter end. An invasion would have cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties and millions of Japanese casualties. The atomic bombs forced Japan to surrender, ending the war quickly and saving lives in the long run. This view has been challenged by revisionist historians who argue that Japan was already on the verge of surrender. They point to evidence that the Emperor and some Japanese leaders were looking for a way to end the war even before the atomic bombs. The naval blockade and conventional bombing had already made Japan's position hopeless. The Soviet declaration of war on August 9th was perhaps even more decisive than the atomic bombs enforcing surrender, as it eliminated Japan's hope for a negotiated peace mediated by the Soviets. From this perspective, the atomic bombs were not necessary to end the war. They may have accelerated the surrender by a few weeks or months, but Japan would have surrendered eventually even without them. The real motivation for using the bombs, some revisionists argue, was to demonstrate American power to the Soviet Union and to end the war before the Soviets could claim a significant role in Japan's defeat. The truth, as usual, is probably somewhere in between these positions. Japan was in a desperate situation by August 1945, but the government was deeply divided about whether and how to surrender. The atomic bombs were one factor among several, including conventional bombing, the naval blockade, and the Soviet invasion, that influenced the Japanese decision to surrender. Whether any single factor was necessary is impossible to determine with certainty. What we can say is that the atomic bombs changed the calculus for Japanese decision-makers. They demonstrated that the United States could destroy Japanese cities without launching an invasion, without suffering casualties, and potentially without end. This made the position of those arguing for continued resistance much weaker. How could Japan hope to inflict enough casualties on the Americans to force negotiations if the Americans could simply keep dropping atomic bombs from a safe distance? The Soviet invasion had a similar effect. It eliminated the hope that the Soviets might broker a negotiated peace, and it raised the terrifying prospect of Soviet occupation. The combination of atomic bombs and Soviet invasion created a situation where continued resistance appeared not just futile, but suicidal. So where does this leave us on the question of the third bomb? If the atomic bombs were necessary to force Japan's surrender, then the third bomb might have been necessary too, had Japan not surrendered when they did. But if the atomic bombs were just one factor among many, and if Japan was already moving towards surrender, then the third bomb would have been an unnecessary atrocity, killing tens of thousands more people for no strategic purpose. The fact that Truman ordered a stop to atomic bombing on August 10th, even before Japan's formal surrender, suggests that he had concluded further atomic attacks were unnecessary. Japan had indicated a willingness to surrender. Further bombing would have been about punishment or demonstration of power, not military necessity. But Truman's order was a close call. If Japan's initial surrender offer on August 10th had been unacceptable, if the negotiations had broken down, if the coup attempt had succeeded, in any of these scenarios, the third bomb would likely have been dropped. The infrastructure was in place, the bomb was ready, and the military and political will to use it existed. Let's talk about the long-term implications of this moment. The decision-making around the third bomb established important precedents about nuclear weapons, but it also revealed patterns that would recur throughout the nuclear age. First, the pattern of bureaucratic momentum. Once military systems are set in motion, they are very difficult to stop. The Manhattan Project had been organized to produce atomic bombs on a continuous basis, and it kept producing them even after the strategic situation had changed. This pattern would repeat throughout the Cold War, with weapons systems being developed and deployed because the infrastructure and institutions to produce them existed, not necessarily because they served a clear strategic purpose. Second, the pattern of civilian-military tension over nuclear weapons. The August 1945 crisis over the third bomb showed that there could be genuine ambiguity about who controlled nuclear weapons and under what circumstances they could be used. This tension has persisted. Military commanders want clarity about when and how they can use the weapons under their control. Civilian leaders want to maintain tight political control over weapons that could start World War III. Balancing these needs has been an ongoing challenge. Third, the pattern of nuclear weapons changing war itself. The atomic bomb wasn't just a more powerful conventional weapon. It changed the fundamental nature of warfare by making it possible to destroy entire cities in moments. This realization grew gradually in August 1945 and would lead to the development of nuclear strategy, deterrence theory, and arms control. Fourth, the pattern of moral ambiguity. The decision to use atomic weapons involved a complex mix of strategic calculation, moral reasoning, bureaucratic process, and human psychology. Trying to determine whether it was right or wrong to drop the atomic bombs, or whether it would have been right or wrong to drop a third, involves wrestling with questions that don't have clear answers. The third bomb also raises questions about counterfactual history. What if Japan hadn't surrendered when they did? How long would the atomic bombing campaign have continued? What would have been the consequences? Some historians have speculated that a prolonged atomic bombing campaign would have been unsustainable for several reasons. First, target availability. As mentioned earlier, the list of suitable targets was finite. Japan had already been heavily bombed, and there were only so many cities large enough and militarily significant enough to justify atomic attack. Second, international reaction. Even in 1945, there was unease about the atomic bombings among some of America's allies. The Soviet Union, while publicly approving, was disturbed by the demonstration of American power. If the United States had continued to drop atomic bombs on Japan week after week, the international reaction might have been much more negative. Third, the production bottleneck. While General Groves estimated that bombs could be produced every 7 to 10 days, this was an optimistic projection. Each bomb required rare materials, complex manufacturing, and careful assembly. A prolonged campaign might have strained the production system. Fourth, domestic opinion. The American public in August 1945 was generally supportive of using atomic bombs to end the war quickly. But a prolonged atomic bombing campaign against an already defeated enemy might have generated more controversy and opposition. On the other hand, we shouldn't underestimate the American determination to achieve unconditional surrender and the willingness to use extreme measures to achieve it. The firebombing campaign had continued for months, despite its terrible cost in civilian lives. There's no reason to think the atomic bombing campaign would have been handled differently if Japan had remained intransigent. The most likely scenario, if Japan had not surrendered in August 1945, is that a third and possibly a fourth atomic bomb would have been dropped, probably in late August or early September. This would have been combined with continued conventional bombing, tightening of the naval blockade, and Soviet advances in Manchuria and Korea. The cumulative pressure would almost certainly have forced Japanese surrender by late September or early October at the latest. The planned invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall, was scheduled to begin in November 1945 with Operation Olympic, the invasion of Kyushu. If somehow Japan had held out until then, the invasion would have gone forward, probably supported by tactical use of atomic bombs against Japanese military concentrations. This would have been unprecedented, nuclear weapons used on a battlefield rather than against cities. Fortunately, none of this happened. Japan surrendered on August 15th. The third bomb was never dropped. The war ended. But the fact that we can construct these plausible counterfactual scenarios shows how contingent the actual outcome was. Let's talk about the legacy of the third bomb in nuclear strategy and policy. The events of August 1945 raised questions that would become central to nuclear strategy in the Cold War and beyond. The most fundamental question is about escalation. If you have a weapon that can destroy a city and you've used it once or twice, what stops you from using it again and again? The implicit answer from August 1945 is political decision-making and civilian control. But this is a fragile barrier. It requires constant vigilance to maintain. During the Cold War, strategists developed elaborate theories about nuclear escalation, how to use nuclear weapons in limited ways without triggering all-out nuclear war. But these theories all assumed tight political control over nuclear weapons and clear lines of communication between adversaries. The experience of August 1945 suggested this assumption might be optimistic. The third bomb also raises questions about nuclear sufficiency. How many nuclear weapons are enough? In August 1945, the United States had 2, then 3, then more. But there was no clear theory about how many were needed for what purpose. This would become a central question in Cold War arms control. What constitutes an adequate deterrent? What is the difference between sufficiency and excess? Some nuclear strategists argued that the smallest possible arsenal that could guarantee unacceptable damage to an adversary was sufficient. Others argued for larger arsenals that could provide more targeting options, greater redundancy, and the ability to fight and win nuclear wars. These debates were prefigured by the questions around the third bomb. Should it be used, or should it be held in reserve? The issue of command and control was also highlighted by the third bomb crisis. Who has the authority to launch nuclear weapons? What safeguards prevent unauthorized or accidental use? What happens if communication links are disrupted in a crisis? These questions became increasingly important as nuclear arsenals grew and delivery systems became faster and more complex. The United States developed elaborate command and control systems, including the nuclear football briefcase that accompanies the president, the two-man rule that requires multiple people to agree before launching weapons, and permissive action links that prevent weapons from being used without proper authorization codes. But all of these systems trace back to the fundamental principle established in August 1945. Nuclear weapons are political tools requiring explicit authorization from civilian leadership, not military weapons to be used at the discretion of commanders. The third bomb also influenced thinking about nuclear weapons and international relations. The atomic bomb gave the United States enormous power in 1945, but this power was temporary. The Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb in 1949, much sooner than American planners had expected. Other nations followed: Britain, France, China, and eventually several others. The question of how to manage a world with multiple nuclear powers became central to post-war international relations. Should nuclear weapons be internationalized and controlled by the United Nations, as some proposed? Should nuclear powers accept limits on their arsenals through arms control agreements? How do you prevent nuclear war when multiple nations have the ability to destroy each other? These questions don't have simple answers, and they're still being debated today. But they all stem from the fundamental reality revealed in August 1945. Nuclear weapons are so powerful that their use cannot be treated as a normal military decision. They require special controls, special thinking, and special institutions. The environmental and health effects of nuclear weapons also became more apparent in the years after 1945. The immediate deaths from blast and fire in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were terrible enough, but the long-term effects of radiation exposure added another dimension of horror. People who survived the initial bombing developed radiation sickness, cancer, and other illnesses years or decades later. Children born to survivors had higher rates of birth defects. These effects were not fully understood in August 1945. The Manhattan Project scientists knew that nuclear weapons produced radiation, but the long-term health consequences were not well documented. As these effects became clearer, they added to the sense that nuclear weapons were qualitatively different from conventional weapons. The environmental effects of nuclear testing also became a major concern. The hundreds of nuclear tests conducted during the Cold War released radioactive fallout into the atmosphere, contaminating soil, water, and food supplies around the world. This led to international movements for a test ban and eventually to the Partial Test Ban Treaty of 1963, which prohibited atmospheric nuclear testing. If the third bomb had been dropped, and if the atomic bombing campaign had continued, these environmental and health effects would have been even worse. Japan would have been more heavily contaminated with radioactive fallout. More people would have been exposed to radiation. The long-term health consequences for Japanese survivors and their descendants would have been even more severe. Let's consider the question of historical memory and how the third bomb fits into how we remember World War II. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are among the most remembered events of the war. They've been commemorated, debated, and analyzed endlessly. Museums, memorials, literature, film, and scholarship have all grappled with their meaning, but the third bomb is largely forgotten. Most people don't know it existed. It doesn't fit neatly into the narrative of the atomic bombings. It's a detail, a footnote, a counterfactual that never happened. Yet in some ways, the third bomb is more revealing than the first two. Hiroshima and Nagasaki can be understood, rightly or wrongly, as discrete decisions to use a new weapon to end a war. They have a certain dramatic finality. The third bomb reveals that the atomic bombings were conceived as a campaign, not as isolated events. It shows us the momentum of military bureaucracy, the difficulty of stopping processes once started, and how close the world came to a very different outcome. The fact that the third bomb isn't widely remembered tells us something about how we construct historical narratives. We prefer clear, dramatic events with beginnings, middles, and ends. We want history to make sense, to have clear causes and effects. The messy reality, that there was a third bomb ready to go, that more bombs were being prepared, that the end of the war was contingent on diplomatic negotiations and last-minute decisions, doesn't fit the clean narrative. This sanitized version of history can be dangerous. It encourages us to think that historical outcomes were inevitable, that things happened the way they did because they had to happen that way. But August 1945 shows us that history is contingent. If Japan's surrender offer had been delayed by a few days, if the coup attempt had succeeded, If Truman had made different decisions, the third bomb would have been dropped, and we would remember World War II very differently. The survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the hibakusha, have played a crucial role in keeping the memory of atomic bombing alive and in advocating for nuclear disarmament. Their testimonies about the horror of atomic warfare have been powerful reminders of what nuclear weapons actually do to human beings. They describe not just the immediate devastation, but the long-term suffering, the keloid scars, the cancers, the social discrimination they faced, the constant fear that their exposure might affect their children. If the third bomb had been dropped, there would have been more hibakusha, more testimonies of suffering, more evidence of the human cost of nuclear warfare. But would it have made a difference to nuclear policy? It's hard to say. The testimonies from Hiroshima and Nagasaki were available throughout the Cold War, but they didn't prevent the nuclear arms race. The superpowers built tens of thousands of nuclear weapons despite knowing exactly what they would do if used. This points to a troubling reality about nuclear weapons. Knowledge of their effects doesn't necessarily translate into political action to eliminate them. The rational arguments against nuclear weapons are overwhelming. They are indiscriminate, inhumane, environmentally catastrophic, and threaten human civilization. Yet they persist, and nations continue to maintain and modernize their nuclear arsenals. The third bomb, in this sense, is a symbol of the gap between what we know and what we do. We knew after Hiroshima and Nagasaki what atomic bombs could do. We knew the human cost. Yet more bombs were being prepared, and they would have been used if the war had continued. Knowledge alone wasn't enough to stop the momentum of nuclear weapons. Let's talk about some of the myths and misconceptions about the atomic bombings, because these affect how we understand the third bomb as well. One common myth is that the atomic bombs were so devastating that Japan immediately surrendered. In reality, as we've discussed, there were several days of tense negotiations between the bombings and the surrender. The Japanese government was deeply divided, and the Emperor's intervention was necessary to break the deadlock. Another myth is that Japan was given clear warning about the atomic bombs. While leaflets were dropped on Japanese cities warning of destruction, they didn't specifically mention atomic weapons, and many cities received such warnings regardless of whether they were actually targeted. The specific warning to Hiroshima and Nagasaki was not significantly different from warnings given to other cities. A third myth is that the atomic bombs prevented 1 million American casualties. This figure comes from Truman's post-war memoirs and has been repeated endlessly, but it's not supported by contemporary military estimates. The actual estimates for Operation Olympic, the first phase of the planned invasion, ranged from tens of thousands to a few 100,000 casualties, not 1 million. The higher figures included Japanese casualties and were based on worst-case scenarios. These myths matter because they shape how we think about the atomic bombings, and by extension about nuclear weapons generally. If we believe the bombs were uniquely necessary and uniquely effective, we might be more willing to accept nuclear weapons as legitimate tools of statecraft. If we understand the more complex reality, that the bombs were one factor among many in ending the war, that their use was not inevitable, and that alternatives existed, we might think differently about nuclear weapons today. The third bomb challenges some of these myths by revealing that the atomic bombings were part of an ongoing campaign rather than a carefully calibrated shock to force surrender. The fact that more bombs were being prepared, that target lists existed, that production schedules were in place, all of this suggests a more routine, bureaucratic approach to atomic warfare than the dramatic narratives usually allow. Let's consider the Japanese perspective on the third bomb and the surrender. For many Japanese, the end of the war was a relief, but it was also a profound shock and humiliation. Japan had never been defeated in its modern history. The idea of unconditional surrender, of foreign occupation, of accepting the complete dismantling of the empire, this was almost unthinkable. The atomic bombs played a role in this psychological shift. They demonstrated that resistance was not just futile but suicidal. Japan could not defend itself against atomic weapons. Every major city could be destroyed without the Americans even risking casualties. This made the militarists' arguments for continued resistance much harder to sustain. If a third bomb had been dropped, it would have further reinforced this sense of helplessness. But it might also have increased Japanese bitterness and resentment toward the United States. The post-war occupation of Japan was remarkably successful, in part because the Japanese people, while defeated, didn't feel they had been unnecessarily brutalized. They had fought hard, been defeated by overwhelming force, and could accept the outcome with some dignity. A prolonged atomic bombing campaign might have changed this dynamic. If Japanese cities had been systematically destroyed one after another after Japan had indicated a willingness to surrender, it would have looked less like military necessity and more like revenge or terrorism. This could have poisoned Japanese-American relations in the post-war period and made the occupation much more difficult. General Douglas MacArthur, who led the occupation of Japan, understood this. He worked to present the occupation as helping Japan rebuild and modernize, rather than punishing it for the war. He kept Emperor Hirohito in place, which provided continuity and legitimacy. He implemented reforms but worked within Japanese institutions where possible. This approach was successful in creating a democratic, peaceful, and prosperous Japan that became an American ally. Would this have been possible if a third, fourth, and fifth atomic bomb had been dropped on Japanese cities? Probably, eventually, but it would have been much harder. The survivors would have had fresh memories of atomic destruction. The sense of grievance would have been stronger. The rebuilding would have been more difficult. So in a sense, the decision to stop atomic bombing after Nagasaki was not just about ending the war, but about shaping the peace. Truman and his advisors may not have consciously thought about it this way in the moment, but their decision to stop had important consequences for post-war Japanese-American relations. The technical details of the third bomb are interesting and reveal something about the state of nuclear weapons in 1945. The plutonium core that was ready in mid-August would have been similar to the Fat Man core used at Nagasaki. It would have weighed about 6 kilograms and would have been surrounded by a tamper to reflect neutrons back into the core and increase the efficiency of the reaction. The explosive yield would have been similar to Fat Man's, around 20 to 22 kilotons. This might seem small by later standards. Thermonuclear weapons would eventually reach yields of multiple megatons, but it was enough to destroy a city. The blast radius would have been roughly a mile from ground zero. The firestorm could have extended several miles further depending on conditions. The bomb would have been delivered by a B-29 bomber, probably flown by the 509th Composite Group from Tinian. The flight would have taken several hours, flying at high altitude to avoid detection and anti-aircraft fire. The bombing run itself would have been similar to the Hiroshima and Nagasaki missions. Visual bombing from about 30,000 feet, with the bomb detonating at about 1,500 to 2,000 feet above the target for maximum effect. The whole process, from the decision to strike to the actual bombing, would have taken at least several days. The bomb would have needed to be transported from Los Alamos to Tinian, assembled, loaded onto the aircraft, and delivered. This meant there was a window for diplomatic intervention or changes in the military situation that could have prevented its use. This is worth emphasizing because it contradicts the sometimes popular image of nuclear weapons as instantaneous. Even with the relatively simple atomic bombs of 1945, there was a significant time lag between the decision to use them and their actual use. This created opportunities for second thoughts, for negotiations, for changing circumstances to alter the outcome. In the Cold War, this time lag would be compressed by new delivery systems, intercontinental ballistic missiles that could strike in half an hour, submarine-launched missiles that could strike in minutes. But in August 1945, nuclear weapons were still slow enough that human decision-making could intervene between intention and execution. Let's talk about some of the lesser-known figures involved in the Manhattan Project and the decision-making around atomic weapons. One interesting figure is Leo Szilard, a Hungarian-American physicist who was one of the first to conceive of nuclear chain reactions and who helped initiate the Manhattan Project by encouraging Albert Einstein to write to President Roosevelt about the possibility of atomic weapons. By 1945, Szilard had become one of the leading skeptics of using the atomic bomb against Japan. He drafted a petition, eventually signed by dozens of Manhattan Project scientists, arguing that the bomb should only be used after Japan had been given a clear warning and an opportunity to surrender. The petition was sent through channels but apparently never reached Truman before the Hiroshima bombing. Szilard's transformation from atomic weapons advocate to atomic weapons opponent prefigured the journey many nuclear scientists would make. He spent the post-war years advocating for international control of atomic energy and warning about the dangers of nuclear proliferation. His concerns about the third bomb and subsequent bombs were vindicated by the Cold War arms race that followed. Another important figure is James Burns, who became Secretary of State in July 1945, just before the Potsdam Conference. Burns was a political operator more than a strategist, and he saw the atomic bomb primarily as a diplomatic tool. He believed it would give the United States enormous leverage in post-war negotiations with the Soviet Union. Burns was reportedly less concerned about the humanitarian implications of atomic bombing and more focused on ending the war quickly before the Soviet Union could claim a significant role in Japan's defeat. He may have been more willing than Truman to continue atomic bombing if Japan didn't surrender immediately. This highlights how different key decision-makers had different priorities and perspectives on nuclear weapons. General Curtis LeMay, who commanded the strategic bombing campaign against Japan, is another crucial figure. LeMay was a ruthless advocate of strategic bombing who believed that destroying enemy civilian morale was a legitimate and effective military strategy. He had overseen the firebombing campaign against Japanese cities and saw the atomic bomb as simply a more efficient tool for the same purpose. LeMay famously said after the war that if the United States had lost, he would have been tried as a war criminal for the bombing campaign against Japan. This stark acknowledgement reveals the moral ambiguity of strategic bombing. LeMay knew what he was doing was terrible, but he believed it was necessary to win the war. He would have had no qualms about using a third, fourth, or fifth atomic bomb if it helped achieve victory. The contrast between figures like Szilard and LeMay shows the range of perspectives within the American military and scientific establishment. There was no consensus about the morality or necessity of atomic bombing. Different people with different backgrounds and values reached different conclusions. This diversity of opinion is important to remember because it means the outcome was not predetermined. If different people had been in key positions, different decisions might have been made. The third bomb might have been dropped, or the first two bombs might never have been used. History was made by human choices, not by abstract forces or inevitable logics. Let's examine the international reaction to the atomic bombings, what it might have been if a third bomb had been dropped. The immediate international reaction to Hiroshima and Nagasaki was mixed. Allied nations generally supported the bombings as necessary to end the war. Neutral nations were more divided. The Soviet Union, while publicly approving, was privately disturbed by the demonstration of American power. The Vatican condemned the atomic bombings, with Pope Pius XII expressing horror at the destruction of civilian populations. Some intellectuals and religious leaders in the United States and Britain also questioned the morality of the bombings. But these were minority voices in August 1945. Most people in Allied nations supported using atomic weapons to end the war quickly. A third bombing might have begun to shift this consensus. The pattern of Hiroshima, then Nagasaki, then a third city being destroyed might have seemed less like a war-ending necessity and more like a systematic campaign of destruction. International opinion might have become more critical, particularly if the third bombing occurred after Japan had indicated a willingness to surrender. The Soviet Union would almost certainly have used a third bombing for propaganda purposes, arguing that it showed American imperialist aggression and disregard for human life. This could have complicated early Cold War dynamics and made it harder for the United States to claim moral high ground in the emerging superpower rivalry. The nascent United Nations which held its first meetings in 1945, would have been another forum for international reaction. The UN Charter included provisions about regulating armaments and promoting international peace and security. Continued atomic bombing of Japan might have led to calls for international control of atomic weapons even earlier than actually occurred. In reality, the United States proposed the Baruch Plan in 1946, which would have placed atomic energy under international control. The Soviet Union rejected this plan, partly because it would have required them to abandon their own atomic weapons program, while the United States still had a nuclear monopoly. But if the United States had used atomic weapons more extensively against Japan, the Soviet rejection might have been even more emphatic, as it would have confirmed Soviet suspicions about American intentions. The moral and legal questions raised by the atomic bombings have been debated ever since. Were they war crimes? Were they justified by military necessity? Do they set precedents for future warfare, or were they unique to the specific circumstances of August 1945? International humanitarian law, as codified in the Geneva Conventions and other treaties, generally prohibits attacks deliberately targeting civilians or using indiscriminate weapons. The atomic bombings arguably violated these principles, though the legal framework in 1945 was less developed than it would become later. The principle of proportionality in war holds that military action should not cause harm that is disproportionate to the military advantage gained. Were the atomic bombings proportionate? This depends on your assessment of the military situation and the alternatives. If you believe the bombs were necessary to prevent a bloody invasion, they might seem proportionate. If you believe Japan was already on the verge of surrender, they seem disproportionate. The principle of discrimination requires distinguishing between combatants and civilians. The atomic bombings obviously failed this test, as they deliberately targeted cities full of civilians. But Sodai continued the conventional bombing campaigns against both German and Japanese cities. The atomic bombings were not unique in this regard. They were simply the most efficient expression of a strategy that had been employed throughout the war. A third bombing would have made these legal and moral questions even more acute. It would have been harder to argue that each successive bombing was necessary to force surrender. The pattern of repeated atomic attacks on cities would have looked increasingly like a policy of systematic destruction rather than a series of difficult but justified military decisions. Some legal scholars have argued that the atomic bombings established a dangerous precedent, that nuclear weapons could be used like conventional weapons, subject to the same military calculations about necessity and proportionality. This precedent, they argue, made nuclear war thinkable and contributed to the arms race that followed. Others argue that the atomic bombings actually established a taboo against nuclear use. The horror of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was so profound that no nation has used nuclear weapons in warfare since 1945, despite numerous opportunities and provocations. This nuclear taboo has been a powerful restraint on nuclear weapons use for over 70 years. If a third bomb had been dropped, would it have strengthened or weakened this taboo? It's hard to say. On one hand, more atomic destruction might have made the horror of nuclear weapons even more vivid and strengthened opposition to their use. On the other hand, a pattern of routine atomic bombing might have normalized nuclear weapons and made them seem like just another military tool rather than something categorically different. The cultural impact of the atomic bombings has been enormous. They've been depicted in countless books, films, documentaries, and works of art. They've shaped our collective imagination about nuclear war and the end of the world. The mushroom cloud has become an iconic symbol of human destructive power. Japanese culture in particular has been profoundly shaped by the atomic bombings. The hibakusha testimonies I mentioned earlier are part of a broader cultural memory that emphasizes the horror of nuclear weapons and the importance of peace. Japanese popular culture, from Godzilla films to anime, often grapples with themes of nuclear destruction and technological hubris. If a third bomb had been dropped, this cultural memory would be even more powerful. Another destroyed city, more testimonies of suffering, more evidence of nuclear horror. Japanese culture might have been even more intensely focused on pacifism and anti-nuclear sentiment. But there's also a risk that multiple bombings could have been processed differently, as evidence of systematic persecution rather than a tragic but necessary end to the war. This could have generated more anger and resentment, potentially complicating the post-war reconciliation between Japan and the United States. In American culture, the atomic bombings are remembered with more ambivalence. There's pride in American technological achievement and relief that the war ended. But there's also discomfort with the massive civilian casualties and questions about whether the bombings were truly necessary. This ambivalence has generated ongoing debates about how to remember and commemorate the atomic bombings. The Enola Gay controversy of the 1990s exemplified this tension. The Smithsonian Institution planned an exhibition about the atomic bombings that would have included Japanese perspectives and critical analysis of the decision to use the bombs. Veterans groups objected, arguing that the exhibition was unpatriotic and dishonored those who fought in World War II. The exhibition was eventually scaled back dramatically. A third bombing would add another layer to these debates. It would be even harder to present the atomic bombings as a single difficult decision made to end the war. The pattern of repeated bombings would be harder to defend and would invite more critical scrutiny. Let's consider the scientific and technical legacy of the Manhattan Project and the third bomb. The Manhattan Project was an unprecedented mobilization of scientific talent and resources. It brought together some of the best physicists, chemists, engineers, and mathematicians in the world to solve an enormously complex technical problem. The success of the Manhattan Project transformed how science was conducted. Before World War II, most scientific research was done by individuals or small groups, often at universities. The Manhattan Project created the model of big science, large-scale, well-funded research programs organized around specific goals with close collaboration between scientists, engineers, and government. This model would persist in the post-war period. The national laboratories created by the Manhattan Project, Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, Hanford, and others, became permanent fixtures of the American scientific landscape. They conducted research not just on nuclear weapons, but on a wide range of scientific and technological problems. The infrastructure that produced the third bomb evolved into the nuclear weapons complex that still exists today. The reactors at Hanford, the enrichment facilities at Oak Ridge, the weapons laboratories at Los Alamos and Livermore all trace their origins back to the Manhattan Project. The production schedules and technical capabilities developed to produce atomic bombs in 1945 were refined and expanded during the Cold War. This raises uncomfortable questions about the relationship between scientific research and military applications. Many Manhattan Project scientists believed they were working to defeat Nazi Germany and prevent Hitler from obtaining atomic weapons. But by the time the bombs were ready, Germany had surrendered. The bombs were used against Japan instead, and the infrastructure created to produce them became the foundation for the nuclear arms race. Some scientists left nuclear weapons work after the war, disillusioned by how their work had been used. Others stayed, arguing that American security required continued nuclear weapons development. Still others worked on civilian applications of nuclear energy while opposing weapons development. The scientific community was divided about the legacy of the Manhattan Project. The technical knowledge gained from building atomic bombs couldn't be unlearned. The physics of nuclear chain reactions, the engineering of bomb components, the chemistry of plutonium production, all of this knowledge would spread despite American efforts to maintain secrecy. The Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb in 1949. Britain followed in 1952. France in 1960, China in 1964. The nuclear club expanded because the fundamental science was publishable and the basic engineering was reproducible. The third bomb, in this sense, was not just a weapon that might have been used in August 1945. It was a harbinger of the thousands of nuclear weapons that would be built in the following decades. It represented the industrialization of nuclear weapons production, the routinization of creating devices capable of destroying cities. Let's talk about the ethics of researching and writing about the third bomb. There's a risk in focusing too much on counterfactual history, on what might have happened but didn't. It can seem like morbid speculation, imagining additional horrors that thankfully never occurred. But I think there's value in understanding the third bomb precisely because it reveals the contingency of history. We tend to treat the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as isolated events with a kind of tragic inevitability. Understanding that a third bomb was ready, that more were being prepared, that the bombing campaign could have continued. This disrupts the neat narrative and forces us to confront the messier reality. It also helps us understand nuclear weapons policy today. The patterns revealed by the third bomb crisis, bureaucratic momentum, ambiguity about control and authorization, the gap between political intentions and military capabilities are still relevant. Nuclear weapons still exist. Command and control systems still struggle with the same basic questions raised in August 1945. Some people might argue that we should just be grateful the third bomb wasn't dropped and move on. Why dwell on something that didn't happen? But I think historical understanding requires grappling with the paths not taken as well as the paths that were. The third bomb shows us how close we came to a different outcome, and what that tells us about human decision-making in the nuclear age. There's also an ethical obligation to the people who would have died if the third bomb had been dropped. They're abstract to us, unnamed potential victims of an attack that never happened. But they were real people living real lives in Japanese cities in August 1945. They survived because of decisions made by Truman, Marshall, and others. Their survival was not inevitable. It was contingent on political choices that could easily have gone differently. Remembering the third bomb is a way of honoring that contingency and recognizing the moral weight of decisions about nuclear weapons. It's not about assigning blame or praise, but about understanding what was at stake and how easily things could have been different. Let's consider what lessons we can draw from the story of the third bomb for contemporary nuclear policy. The most obvious lesson is about the importance of civilian control over nuclear weapons. The crisis in August 1945 showed that military systems, once set in motion, can operate according to their own logic unless political leadership actively intervenes. Today's nuclear command and control systems are much more sophisticated than those of 1945, but the basic principle remains. Nuclear weapons must be under firm civilian control, with clear authorization procedures and multiple safeguards against unauthorized use. The lessons of the third bomb helped establish this principle. Another lesson is about the importance of clear communication and deliberate decision-making. The ambiguity about whether Truman had authorized a bombing campaign or specific bombing missions created confusion and risk. Modern nuclear command and control systems try to minimize this ambiguity through elaborate protocols and procedures. But the potential for miscommunication and misunderstanding still exists, especially in crisis situations. The third bomb also teaches us about the difficulty of stopping processes once they're started. The Manhattan Project had enormous momentum by August 1945. Stopping the production and use of atomic bombs required deliberate intervention by senior leadership. This suggests the importance of building off-ramps into military systems, ways to pause, reconsider, and change course even after operations have begun. In contemporary nuclear strategy, this might mean building in delays and decision points that allow for reflection and communication before weapons are used. It might mean maintaining multiple channels of communication with potential adversaries to reduce the misunderstanding. It might mean resisting pressures for launch on warning or highly automated systems that reduce human decision-making time. The third bomb also reminds us that nuclear weapons are not just technical systems, but political and moral choices. The infrastructure existed to keep dropping atomic bombs on Japan. What stopped it was a political decision that the costs outweighed the benefits. This means that nuclear policy is ultimately about values and priorities, not just technical capabilities. Today's debates about nuclear weapons, about modernization, about arms control, about the role of nuclear weapons in national security strategy are fundamentally political and moral debates. Understanding the history of nuclear weapons, including the story of the third bomb, can inform these debates by showing us what's at stake and how decisions are actually made in practice. Let's talk about some of the specific targeting considerations for the third bomb, based on what we know from declassified documents. The target committee that selected Hiroshima and Nagasaki used several criteria: military or industrial significance, urban concentration that would demonstrate the bomb's destructive power, and relative lack of previous bombing damage so the effects could be clearly assessed. By mid-August 1945, the list of cities that met these criteria had narrowed considerably. Most major Japanese cities had already been heavily bombed. Kokura, which had been the primary target for the Nagasaki mission, was still on the list. It was an important arsenal city with significant military manufacturing. Niigata, on the west coast of Honshu, was another possibility. It was a port city with some industrial facilities and had been less heavily bombed than most major cities. However, it was somewhat isolated geographically, which made it a less obvious target. Sapporo, the largest city in Hokkaido, was also under consideration. It had not been heavily bombed and had some military significance. However, it was far north and somewhat peripheral to the main theaters of war. Some documents suggest that Tokyo itself might have been considered for a third atomic attack. Much of Tokyo had already been destroyed by the March 1945 firebombing, but the city was so large that significant areas remained intact. An atomic bombing of Tokyo would have had enormous psychological impact as an attack on the capital. However, there were arguments against bombing Tokyo. The emperor and the government were there, and destroying them might eliminate the possibility of negotiated surrender. Also, the symbolism of destroying the capital might have been seen as excessive and might have complicated post-war occupation plans. Another factor in targeting decisions was the desire to demonstrate different aspects of the bomb's capabilities. Hiroshima had been chosen partly because its geography, surrounded by hills, would contain and reflect the blast, maximizing damage. Nagasaki's topography was actually less ideal, but it was selected after cloud cover prevented bombing of Kokura. For a third bomb, military planners might have looked for a target that would demonstrate yet another aspect of atomic weapons, perhaps a more dispersed urban area, or a target with particular industrial or military significance. But by mid-August, with Japan moving towards surrender, these tactical considerations were becoming less relevant than the strategic and political questions about whether to continue bombing at all. The geography of Japan itself was a limiting factor. Japan is a relatively small, mountainous country, with most of its population concentrated in coastal urban areas. By August 1945, many of these urban areas had already been bombed. The list of targets suitable for atomic attack was finite and shrinking. This meant that a sustained atomic bombing campaign would eventually have faced a target selection problem. Either bomb smaller cities of less military significance, which would dilute the strategic impact, or bomb already damaged cities, which would make it harder to assess the specific effects of atomic weapons. Neither option was ideal from a military planning perspective. Some historians have speculated that if the atomic bombing campaign had continued into September or October 1945, the military might have shifted to tactical use of atomic weapons against specific military targets rather than strategic bombing of cities. The planned invasion of Japan would have created opportunities to use atomic weapons against troop concentrations, fortifications, or other military objectives. This would have represented a significant shift in nuclear strategy, from strategic city bombing to tactical battlefield use. It might have established a different precedent for nuclear weapons, treating them more like conventional weapons and less like civilization-ending strategic tools. Whether this would have made nuclear war more or less likely in the long run is an interesting counterfactual question. Let's consider the role of chance and contingency in this story. History often seems inevitable in retrospect, but the events of August 1945 were full of moments where things could have gone differently. What if the weather had been different? The Nagasaki bombing almost didn't happen because of cloud cover over both Kokura and Nagasaki. The bombardier had to make a visual sighting of the target before dropping the bomb, per explicit orders. If the clouds hadn't broken over Nagasaki at the last moment, the B-29 might have returned to Tinian with the bomb still on board. This would have delayed the second bombing, potentially changing the entire sequence of events. What if the coup attempt in Japan had been better organized? If the hardliners had managed to seize the emperor and prevent the surrender broadcast, the war might have continued for weeks or months. The third bomb would certainly have been dropped, and probably more after that. What if Truman had been a different kind of person? A more hawkish president might have continued the atomic bombing without hesitation. A more dovish president might never have authorized the first bombings. Truman's particular combination of traits, his willingness to use extreme measures, but also his discomfort with killing all those kids, shaped the outcome. What if the Soviet Union hadn't declared war when it did? Japan's hope for Soviet mediation was a key factor keeping the peace faction weak before August 9th. If the Soviets had delayed their invasion of Manchuria, Japan might not have moved towards surrender as quickly, and more atomic bombs would have been used. What if key individuals had been in different places? If Secretary Stimson had been ill or absent during this crucial period, if General Marshall had been unavailable, if key scientists had failed to produce plutonium cores on schedule, any of these contingencies could have changed the outcome. This web of contingencies reminds us that history is made by human decisions in specific contexts, not by abstract forces or inevitable logics. The third bomb wasn't dropped because of a series of decisions made by specific people at specific times. Different people or different circumstances would have produced different outcomes. This has implications for how we think about nuclear weapons today. Nuclear deterrence theory often assumes rational actors making careful calculations about costs and benefits. But the story of the third bomb shows that real decision-making is messier, more contingent, more dependent on individual personalities and chance circumstances than abstract models suggest. It also reminds us that the absence of nuclear war since 1945 is not necessarily because deterrence works perfectly or because the logic of mutually assured destruction is foolproof. It's partly because of specific decisions made by specific people in specific circumstances, and partly because of luck. We've avoided nuclear war not just through good policy, but also through fortunate timing, capable leaders, and the absence of worst-case scenarios. Let's talk about the psychological dimensions of decision-making about nuclear weapons. The people who made decisions about the atomic bombs in August 1945 were operating under enormous stress and with incomplete information. They were dealing with questions that had no historical precedent and making decisions whose consequences would reverberate through history. Truman later claimed he never lost sleep over the decision to use atomic bombs. Some historians take this at face value as evidence of a clear conscience. Others see it as psychological denial or post hoc rationalization. The comment about all those kids suggests Truman was more troubled than he later admitted. The scientists who built the bombs had their own psychological burdens. Many report feelings of pride in their technical achievements mixed with horror at what they had created. Oppenheimer's famous quote about becoming death, the destroyer of worlds, captures this ambivalence. Some scientists suffered from what we might now call post-traumatic stress, grappling with their role in creating weapons of mass destruction. The military officers who planned and executed the bombing missions had to compartmentalize to do their jobs. The crew of the Enola Gay was trained to think of the mission in technical terms: navigation, bomb delivery, evasive maneuvers. They couldn't afford to think too much about the tens of thousands of people they were about to kill. Some crew members struggled with this afterwards. Others maintained that they were just doing their duty. The psychological impact on the Japanese victims is well documented through hibakusha testimonies. Beyond the immediate physical trauma, survivors suffered from guilt about living when others died, from fear of radiation's long-term effects, from social stigma, and from recurring nightmares and traumatic memories. The psychological wounds of nuclear attack are profound and long-lasting. If a third bomb had been dropped, all of these psychological burdens would have been multiplied. More American decision-makers carrying the weight of authorizing attacks on cities. More scientists grappling with the consequences of their work. More aircrews carrying out bombing missions. And most of all, more Japanese survivors traumatized by atomic warfare. The psychological dimension of nuclear weapons is often overlooked in strategic analysis, but it's crucial. Nuclear weapons aren't just physical objects or strategic tools. They're symbols, fears, traumas. They shape how we think about security, mortality, and the future of civilization. Understanding the psychological impact of nuclear weapons, including the counterfactual impact of the third bomb, helps us understand why nuclear policy is so fraught and so important. Let's consider the economic dimensions of the Manhattan Project and the third bomb. The Manhattan Project cost about $2 billion in 1945 dollars, equivalent to perhaps $30 billion today. This was an enormous investment, requiring presidential authorization to redirect resources from other war efforts. The cost per bomb was substantial. Each plutonium core represented months of reactor operation at Hanford. Each bomb assembly required precious materials and skilled labor. From a purely economic perspective, using the bombs as quickly as possible made sense. They were expensive tools sitting idle rather than contributing to victory. This economic logic contributed to the momentum toward continued atomic bombing. The sunk costs were enormous. Not using the weapons would mean that investment had been wasted. This is a form of the sunk cost fallacy, but it's psychologically powerful nonetheless. In the post-war period, the economic infrastructure of nuclear weapons production became even more significant. Entire communities depended on nuclear weapons facilities for employment. Corporations profited from nuclear weapons contracts. Congressional districts received federal funding for nuclear facilities. This created powerful economic constituencies for continued nuclear weapons production. The third bomb, and the production system that created it, was the beginning of what President Eisenhower would later call the military-industrial complex. The Manhattan Project showed that enormous federal investments in military technology could drive economic activity and create politically powerful interests. This pattern would intensify during the Cold War. Understanding the economic dimensions helps explain why nuclear weapons programs are so difficult to stop or scale back. It's not just about strategic necessity or military requirements. It's also about jobs, profits, regional economic impacts, and political constituencies. The third bomb was being produced not just because of military orders, but because an economic system had been created to produce it. Let's talk about what happened in the immediate aftermath of Japan's surrender and how the third bomb fits into that story. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's broadcast announced Japan's surrender. For the Japanese people, this was a moment of profound shock and relief. The war was finally over. The bombing would stop. Japan had been defeated, but it would survive. For Americans and other Allied populations, it was a moment of jubilation. The long, terrible war was over. The boys would come home. The sacrifices had been worth it. There was relatively little reflection in that moment about the human cost of atomic bombing. That would come later. For the Manhattan Project personnel, it was a moment of vindication mixed with uncertainty. Their weapon had worked. It had helped end the war. But now what? What would happen to the project? What would happen to nuclear weapons? The third bomb, still being assembled at Los Alamos, suddenly had no target. It represented a bridge between wartime and peacetime nuclear weapons production. It had been created as a weapon of war, but by the time it was ready, the war was over. What was it for now? General Groves moved quickly to establish the post-war role of the Manhattan Project. He argued that the United States needed to maintain its nuclear capabilities in the uncertain post-war environment. The Soviet Union was emerging as a potential threat. The atomic bomb was America's ace in the hole. The infrastructure should be maintained, the production should continue, the weapons should be stockpiled. Not everyone agreed with this logic. Some argued that the end of the war provided an opportunity to establish international control over atomic energy, preventing an arms race before it started. Scientists who had worked on the Manhattan Project drafted proposals for international control and arms limitation. The Akis and Lilienthal report, developed in 1946, proposed placing all atomic energy production under international authority. This became the basis for the Baruch Plan presented to the United Nations. But the plan required intrusive inspections and would have required the Soviet Union to forego its own atomic weapons program while the United States still had bombs. The Soviets rejected it, and the opportunity for international control passed. The third bomb, then, represents a turning point. It was the first atomic bomb created not for immediate use, but as part of an ongoing production program. It was the first weapon of the nuclear age, rather than the last weapon of World War II. Its production continued not because of clear military necessity, but because the infrastructure existed and the strategic logic of the emerging Cold War seemed to require it. Let's examine some of the specific documentary evidence about the third bomb. Declassified Manhattan Project documents, memoirs from key participants, and historical research have revealed details about the production schedules and military planning in August 1945. A memo from General Groves, dated August 10, 1945, discusses production schedules for additional plutonium cores. It indicates that another core would be ready for shipment by August 12th or 13th, with additional cores following at regular intervals. This confirms that the third bomb was not hypothetical, but actively being produced. General Marshall's order halting further atomic bombings without presidential authorization, dated August 10th, is another crucial document. It shows the command and control crisis that emerged and how civilian leadership had to intervene to assert control over nuclear weapons. Henry Wallace's diary entry about Truman's comment regarding all those kids provides insight into Truman's thinking on August 10th. While we should be cautious about relying too heavily on second-hand accounts, Wallace was present at the meeting and recorded his impressions soon afterward. Japanese documents from the same period show the internal debates within the Japanese government. The Supreme War Council was deadlocked between those favoring surrender and those favoring continued resistance. The Emperor's intervention, recorded in multiple sources, was decisive in breaking this deadlock. Soviet documents from this period, declassified after the Cold War ended, reveal Stalin's thinking about the atomic bombs and the Japanese surrender. The Soviets accelerated their invasion of Manchuria, partly in response to the atomic bombings, hoping to establish territorial claims before Japan surrendered. This shows how the atomic bombs had strategic implications beyond their immediate military impact. These documents don't tell us everything. Many records remain classified or were never created in the first place. Key conversations were not documented. Personal motivations and private thoughts are difficult to reconstruct. But the available evidence clearly shows that a third bomb was being prepared, that there were plans for its use, and that its deployment was prevented by Japan's timely surrender and by deliberate decisions to halt atomic bombing. Let's consider the third bomb in the context of other what-ifs of World War II. What if Germany had developed atomic weapons first? What if the D-Day invasion had failed? What if Hitler had been assassinated? What if Japan had surrendered after Germany's defeat? These counterfactuals help us understand the contingency of history and the importance of specific decisions and events. They also help us appreciate how things actually turned out and recognize that better and worse outcomes were both possible. The third bomb counterfactual is particularly poignant because it came so close to happening. Unlike speculative scenarios about Germany developing atomic weapons, which was never close to success, the third bomb was actually being built. Unlike scenarios about failed invasions or successful assassinations, the third bomb required only a slight change in timing, Japan surrendering a few days later or Truman deciding differently, to become reality. This makes the third bomb more than just an interesting historical footnote. It's a reminder that history isn't fixed or inevitable. The decisions made in August 1945 shaped the world we live in today. Different decisions would have created a different world. The third bomb that wasn't dropped is as much a part of our history as the two bombs that were. In conclusion, the story of the third atomic bomb reveals crucial truths about nuclear weapons, about decision-making in war, and about human nature. It shows us that the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not